President Trump is meeting with key leaders in London for the two-day NATO summit. Mr. Trump has already met with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and French President Emmanuel Macron. But the meeting came just hours after he attacked Macron for comments last month that NATO was, quote, brain dead without U.S. leadership.
And I heard that President Macron said NATO is brain dead. I think that's very insulting to a lot of different forces, including a man that does a very good job in running NATO. It's a tough statement, though, when you make a statement like that. That is a very, very nasty statement to essentially 28, including them, 28 countries.
During their meeting, Macron said he stands by his comments. President Trump did not continue to criticize the French president. CBS News White House correspondent Ben Tracy is traveling with the president and joins me now from London. Hi, Ben. President Trump has repeatedly threatened to withdraw from NATO and even previously called it obsolete. So why did he sort of switch gears today and begin defending it against criticism from France?
Yeah, this really is quite a reversal. I mean, we have heard President Trump and candidate Trump, frankly, for that matter, really rail against NATO, questioning whether it was needed anymore and really complaining often and loudly about how much the U.S. funds it and that these other countries are not really pulling their own weight. Today, you hear something very different, and I think the question is this really a strategic reevaluation of NATO by the president, or more likely, is he responding to the fact that Emmanuel Macron has now kind of dumped on NATO and the president now wants to take the opposite position? So what you heard is after Macron said that NATO is strategically brain dead, you had the president coming out basically saying that's a horrible thing to say about NATO. Nobody should talk ill about NATO unless it's, of course, President Trump.
All right, Ben, so how did the president's meeting with the French president go after he made those comments just hours before meeting him?
Well, you could call it tense, you could call it awkward. It certainly was one to watch. The body language is always interesting between these two, who were fast friends at the beginning of President Trump's presidency and now have kind of fallen out of favor with each other. But they didn't go at it in terms of President Trump was kind of baited by some of the questions as to what he had said earlier about Macron, and he did not repeat them in front of him. They did disagree about some other things. They talked about trade a little bit because the U.S. is now threatening new tariffs on French goods. The more interesting part came when President Trump said, I have some nice ISIS fighters I'd like to send to France, some of these captured ISIS fighters. And President Macron gave a very long answer about France doing its part, and President Trump kind of smirked and said, that's the greatest non-answer I've ever heard.
So there was some news that came out of their meeting that caused the markets to drop when the president once again suggested a trade deal with China could wait until after the 2020 election. What's going on behind the scenes that makes the president suddenly willing to wait that long?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is so much the president willing to wait as there really being no other option, because it just doesn't seem like this deal is getting done. We've been told for weeks now that this phase one of this trade deal was in its final stage. They were simply writing it down on paper. That just doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be some sticking points here, and likely these are the bigger issues, the things that the U.S. wants from China in terms of intellectual property theft from U.S. companies, access to markets in China for U.S. companies. These are things the Chinese have pushed back on, and mainly the Chinese have said, we'll buy a bunch of agricultural products from your farmers in Iowa, and maybe that's good enough. It doesn't yet appear to be good enough for the White House.
And Ben, there also appeared to be confusion over whether the president supports the anti-government protests in Iran. What exactly is his position?
Yeah, so the president was asked pretty directly, do you support these protesters in Iran? And he said, I don't want to talk about that, but then said no. But then right after that meeting, the president sent out a tweet saying, yes, we do support these protesters, always have. He then clarified that on camera, saying that the question that he thought he was being asked is, does the U.S. financially support them? He says the U.S. does not, but does support what they're trying to do in Iran. Speaking of protesters, if you're hearing that noise behind me, those are protesters here outside of Buckingham Palace. Right now, President Trump is inside there with the Queen and the other NATO leaders, and you have a mix of protests out here. Some of it is anti-Trump. A lot of it is about Brexit and other things that are going on here in the UK.
All right. Well, Ben Tracy in London, thank you.